The snowflakes that fell on Harwick Avenue that New Year's Eve were the fat, lazy kind. The kind that settled on a child's eyelashes and turned the whole city into a snow globe. Arthur Pendleton stood on the sidewalk outside Aubergine, the most prestigious restaurant in the city's financial district, and tilted his face upward for a moment, letting the cold silence wash over him. 6 years ago, he had stood in kitchens 3 times as expensive as this one. Tonight, he was just a father. Daddy. A small, mittened hand tugged at his coat. The gray wool overcoat that had seen 3 winters too many, its hem slightly frayed, its buttons replaced twice. Are we going in? My nose is cold. Arthur looked down at Lily. She was dressed in the red velvet dress he'd found at the church thrift sale in October and hidden under his bed ever since, waiting for this night. Her copper-red hair was brushed into 2 neat braids, tied with ribbons he'd bought at the dollar store. She had her mother's eyes, large, gray-green, and impossible to lie to. We're going in, he said, taking her hand. Happy birthday, Bug. She beamed. She always beamed. Even at 6 years old, Lily Pendleton carried sunshine in her chest like a portable lantern, and Arthur had learned long ago to navigate the dark simply by walking toward her. He had been saving for this dinner for 4 months. $43 here, $20 there. The tips from the Tuesday lunch rush set aside in a coffee can on the kitchen shelf. Aubergine was not, strictly speaking, within the universe of restaurants Arthur Pendleton could afford, but it had been Caroline's favorite. On the night Arthur had proposed, 9 years ago, he had brought her here, sat across from her in the corner booth with a ring he'd designed himself hidden in a creme brulee, and he'd watched her face move through every shade of joy he would spend the rest of his life trying to recreate. He'd promised himself that one day, he would bring Lily here on her birthday. That day was today. The maitre d' at the door looked at Arthur's coat, and then at Lily's dress with the kind of practiced, subtle dismissal that leaves no fingerprints. He led them to their table with only the smallest hesitation. Inside, Aubergine was everything the snow outside was not. The dining room was warm amber light and the low murmur of wealth at ease. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. The white tablecloths were so perfectly starched they looked carved from marble. The smell, saffron, butter, roasting garlic, was like being greeted by something ancient and generous. And Arthur had to breathe through his nose slowly to keep his face neutral, because the smell, above all things, was the smell of his old life. He helped Lily onto her chair, tucked a napkin into her lap the way she liked, and opened his menu with the studied calm of a man who had been to better restaurants than this in a different lifetime. They were almost through their breadbasket when the room changed. It was a subtle thing at first, a tension that moved through the staff like a current through water. Waiter straightened. The low murmur of conversation dropped. Arthur noticed the maitre d' move quickly toward the entrance, adjusting his jacket. Then the doors opened. She came in the way hurricanes arrive, without announcement, but with the immediate, undeniable understanding that everything was about to change. Evelyn Vance was wearing a black cashmere coat that probably cost more than Arthur's monthly rent. Her dark hair swept back severely, her cheekbones carved as if from something harder than bone. She was the kind of beautiful that did not invite warmth, the kind that made people step back rather than step toward. 2 men in dark suits flanked her at a respectful distance. She was 32 years old and looked like she had never once in her life been told no. The manager, Sterling, his name badge read, Mr. Harrison Sterling, General Manager, appeared at Arthur's table approximately 90 seconds after Evelyn Vance walked through the door. His voice carried the polished contempt of someone who had decided Arthur was an inconvenience long before this moment. Miss Vance has purchased the exclusive use of Aubergine for this evening. All existing diners are being offered a full refund plus a complimentary voucher. He paused, letting his eyes travel down Arthur's coat with something just short of a sneer. I'm sure you'll find many more suitable venues for your celebration. We have a reservation, Arthur said, and it's my daughter's birthday. Sterling leaned forward, dropping his voice to something meant to humiliate. Sir, I understand. But between us, his gaze dropped to Arthur's coat again. You'll be much more comfortable somewhere else. I'm sure you can find a lovely fast food establishment that's still open on New Year's Eve. The table next to them had gone quiet. A woman in pearls pretended to examine her wine. Arthur breathed in slowly. He had been humiliated before, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in headlines. He had learned to let it pass through him like cold water, to find the bedrock beneath and stand there. He was about to take Lily's hand and walk out with his dignity intact when Lily moved. She had not heard everything. Arthur had covered her ears at the worst of it, but she had felt the temperature of the exchange. And Lily, who had been born with more emotional intelligence than most adults Arthur knew, slid off her chair, reached into the small canvas bag she carried everywhere, and produced a cupcake. It was wrapped in parchment paper, slightly lopsided from the bag, its vanilla frosting a little smeared. She had made it herself that afternoon, standing on her step stool at the kitchen counter, proud enough of it to give it a name. "This one's called Snowy," she had announced, and had refused to let it be eaten at home because she wanted to share it somewhere special. She carried it now across the polished floor of Aubergine's dining room, past the silent tables, toward Evelyn Vance. Evelyn had been watching the scene with the flat, disinterested expression of someone waiting for an unpleasant but necessary process to complete. When the small red-haired child in the velvet dress approached her, she looked down with the kind of regard a CEO gives an item placed unexpectedly on the boardroom table. "Happy New Year," Lily said, holding up the cupcake in both hands. "My daddy made this with me. He says nobody should be alone on New Year's." She tilted her head. "Are you alone?" Something passed across Evelyn Vance's face. It was fast, almost too fast, but Arthur, watching from across the room, caught it. A flicker, a fracture. "I'm not alone," Evelyn said, her voice even and cool. "I have staff." Lily considered this with the philosophical gravity of a 6-year-old. "That's not the same," she said finally. "Fake it. Daddy says cupcakes fix things." Evelyn looked at the cupcake. She looked at it the way you look at something you recognize but cannot quite place. A half-remembered melody, a color from a dream. Then, perhaps because refusing a cupcake from a child in a red velvet dress on New Year's Eve was beyond even her capacity for coldness, she took it. She peeled back the parchment. She brought it to her nose, not to taste, but to smell. And the world stopped. Because the scent that rose from that small, lopsided cupcake was vanilla, but not the ordinary kind. It was vanilla and a thread of burnt sugar, and underneath it something warmer. Almond extract, a whisper of cinnamon, nutmeg so faint it was barely there. It was a smell that did not belong in any recipe book or online tutorial because it had never been written down. It had been passed from one pair of hands to another in a quiet hospice room 12 years ago, between a dying woman and a young volunteer who sat at her bedside reading to her. It was Margaret Vance's recipe, Evelyn's mother's recipe. Not similar, not inspired by. The exact proportions of the exact ingredients that Evelyn had not smelled since the week before her mother's funeral. Evelyn Vance, who had not cried in public since she was 19 years old, who had faced hostile takeovers and boardroom coups, and the slow erosion of her grief, with the composure of someone who had decided that weakness was a weapon given to enemies, pressed the cupcake to her lips and took a bite, and came apart. It happened quietly. No dramatic scene, no heaving sobs. Just the way a very old wall comes down, not with an explosion, but with a soft, exhausted surrender. Her eyes filled. Her shoulders dropped a quarter inch. And then she bent her knees and sank, slowly and without any of her characteristic control, until she was kneeling on the floor of Aubergine's dining room, in her $1,000 coat, with a homemade cupcake held in both hands, weeping. The entire restaurant held its breath. Lily, rather than being frightened, knelt down beside Evelyn and put one small hand on her arm. "It's okay," Lily said. "Cupcakes make my daddy cry sometimes too. He says that means they're made with the right stuff." The aftermath moved quickly. Evelyn stood, or rather, composed herself back to standing, which was a different thing, and when she turned to face her staff, her eyes were still bright, but her voice had returned to its familiar register of authority. "Mr. Sterling," she said. The manager materialized at her elbow instantly. "Miss Vance, you're fired." The silence in the room took on a new quality. Sterling blinked. "Miss Vance, with respect, effective immediately," Evelyn said. "You spoke to a guest of this restaurant with deliberate cruelty. That is not a behavior I compensate." She paused. "Security will accompany you out." One of her suited men stepped forward. Sterling went the color of old plaster. For a moment he looked at Arthur with an expression that had lost all its polish, something raw and humiliated beneath it. And Arthur, who had spent several years becoming intimate with humiliation, allowed himself one small breath of something like relief. He did not gloat. It had never been in him to gloat. Evelyn then turned to Arthur and Lily, and for the first time her face carried something other than iron. It was not quite warmth. Not yet. But it was the careful, deliberate absence of coldness, which in Evelyn Vance's vocabulary was perhaps the closest thing. "Please," she said, "sit down. You bought out the restaurant." Arthur said, not unkindly. "I did." She looked at Lily, then back at him. "I've unbought it." "Sit down, Mr. Pendleton," he said. "Arthur." "Mr. Pendleton." She gestured toward the table where their bread basket still sat. "And the birthday girl, please." They sat. What happened over the following 2 hours was not something Arthur would be able to adequately describe later. It was not romance. Not yet. And perhaps not even approaching it. It was something stranger and more fundamental than romance. It was the sensation of being seen. Evelyn Vance, who had walked into that restaurant intending to spend New Year's Eve in the controlled solitude she had constructed for herself over the past decade, found herself across a table from a man who passed the salt without being asked and talked to his daughter about the stars visible through the restaurant window with the quiet, attentive love of someone who had decided that this small person was the most important thing in the universe. She watched Arthur cut Lily's food into careful pieces without breaking the thread of their conversation. She watched him notice when Lily's water glass was half empty and refill it. She watched him wipe a smear of butter from Lily's chin with his thumb, and Lily caught his hand and held it for a moment, and something in Evelyn's chest constricted painfully. "How did you know the recipe?" Evelyn asked, when the main course had been cleared and Lily was absorbed in the task of arranging her dessert spoons into a pattern. Arthur looked up. He had known this question was coming, had seen her circling it all evening. "My wife," he said. "Caroline." He said her name the way you say the name of something beloved, with a small, careful exhale at the end. "She spent 3 months volunteering at the Greenview Hospice, years ago, before we were married. She used to say there was a woman there who taught her how to bake." Evelyn went very still. "She never told me the woman's name," Arthur continued. "Just said she was extraordinary. Kind. The kind of kind that doesn't require an audience." He looked at his hands for a moment. "When she was in the hospice herself, near the end, she asked me to learn the recipe. She said it was important that Lily know it someday, that it came from a good woman and should be kept alive." The candlelight moved between them like something breathing. "Her name was Margaret," Evelyn said, and her voice was barely a voice. "My mother. She was at Greenview from late autumn until she died in February. I was finishing my MBA. I wasn't there enough." She stopped. She had never said that sentence aloud before, not to her therapist, not to anyone. "I wasn't there enough." It sat on the table between them like the most truthful thing in the room. "The woman who was there," Arthur said gently, "your mother, was there every day, in whatever way she could be. Caroline talked about her for the rest of her life. She said she'd never met anyone who could make a room warmer just by being in it." Evelyn looked at the cupcake again. She did not cry this time. She had already spent that, and what was left was something quieter and deeper, a grief that had been frozen for 12 years, now just barely beginning to thaw. "She was like that," Evelyn said. "She was very much like that." Lily looked up from her spoons. "Is your mommy gone too?" she asked Evelyn. "Yes," Evelyn said. Lily nodded gravely. "Mine too. But Daddy says they don't really go away. They just go somewhere we can't see yet." She returned to her spoons. "I think that's nice." Evelyn looked at Arthur over the top of Lily's head. He shrugged slightly, the helpless, wondering shrug of a man who had been parented by his own child more times than he could count. "She's usually right," he said quietly. When they finally left, at nearly midnight, Lily half asleep in Arthur's arms, her red velvet dress dusted with powdered sugar from the dessert she'd eventually demolished. Evelyn stood at the door of Aubergine and watched them walk out into the snow. She had nothing prepared to say, but she stood there longer than she meant to, watching the snow close around the shape of a man and a small girl until there was nothing left but white and the slow, quiet fall of it, and the smell of vanilla that seemed to linger long after it had any reason to. 3 days into the new year, Evelyn Vance did something she had not done in a decade. She made a decision based entirely on feeling rather than strategy. She had her driver take her to the Millbrook district. It was not the kind of neighborhood Evelyn's car usually visited. The streets were narrow and the buildings had the tired, dignified look of places that had been promised renovation for 20 years. The snow from New Year's Eve was still banked against the curbs, gray-edged now, and the storefronts showed their economic range plainly. A check-cashing place beside a laundromat beside a bakery whose window held a handwritten sign advertising holiday specials that had gone out of date. And there, between a dry cleaner and a hardware store, was a place called Penny's Diner. The sign was slightly crooked. The painted lettering was old enough to have the comfortable fading of something established rather than neglected. There was a string of lights along the window that someone, Arthur, she guessed, had not yet taken down from Christmas. She told her driver to wait and went in alone. The inside was warm, genuinely warm, not just heated. Warm the way places get when they are regularly filled with people who mean well. The booths were mismatched vinyl, patched in places with electrical tape, but every surface was meticulously clean. The counter had 6 stools. Behind it, a woman of about 60 with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain was filling salt shakers with the methodical contentment of someone who enjoyed her work. "Seat yourself, honey," she said, without looking up. Evelyn sat at the counter. The coffee, when it arrived, was excellent, the kind of excellent that catches you off guard in a place where you weren't expecting it. She was on her second cup when the noise began outside. 3 men, thick-necked, wearing heavy jackets, carrying the loose, entitled energy of people accustomed to being obeyed. Arthur was standing at the alley entrance, a large garbage bag in each hand, having apparently just come out to do the morning disposal. He did not look alarmed. He looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. 6 months, the largest man was saying. "You're 6 months behind on the arrangement, Pendleton. Mr. Cassius is not a patient man. Tell Mr. Cassius his arrangement expired the day he sent someone to break my window," Arthur said, setting the bags down carefully. His voice was very quiet, quieter than the situation seemed to call for. "And tell him if anyone comes back here again, the next conversation will not be between Mr. Cassius and me." The large man laughed. His companions laughed with him, the way men laugh when they think they have already won. "You going to threaten us, diner man? In that apron?" Arthur looked at his apron, green canvas, flour-dusted, as if noticing it for the first time. Then he looked back at the 3 men with an expression that Evelyn, watching through the window, found difficult to categorize. It was not fear. It was not anger exactly. It was the expression of someone who has done a thorough threat assessment and found the result unimpressive. "I'm going to ask you," Arthur said, "to leave. Once." Something in his tone made the large man pause, just a fraction, the way animals pause at a stimulus that doesn't match their expectations. There was something in Arthur Pendleton's stillness that had the quality of deep water, calm on the surface, but carrying enormous pressure beneath. The pause stretched another second, and then, with the grumbling bluster of men performing a retreat they were pretending was a choice, the 3 men left. Arthur picked up his garbage bags and finished what he had been doing. The woman with the silver hair, Dorothy, Evelyn would learn later, the diner's sole full-time employee, and by all available evidence, its emotional backbone, was watching Evelyn with the benign patience of someone who has seen many things and finds most of them interesting. "You were waiting for him to need help," Dorothy said, without ruffling. "I was evaluating the situation," Evelyn said. Dorothy refilled Evelyn's coffee. "He never needs help. Doesn't mean people shouldn't offer." The envelope arrived at Penny's Diner 2 days later, delivered by a woman in a tailored suit who left it on the counter without further explanation. Arthur opened it after the lunch rush, standing at the prep counter where he worked every morning. Inside was a check. The number of zeros made him blink. He put it back in the envelope. He put the envelope in his apron pocket. He thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and when the last customer had gone and Dorothy had hung up her apron and Lily was doing her homework at the corner booth with a hot chocolate, he called the number on the accompanying card. She answered on the second ring. "Thank you," he said. "But no." A pause. "No, I can't take this. It's not charity." Her voice was different on the phone, less the polished public instrument he'd heard in the restaurant, something with more grain to it, more texture. "Consider it a business investment. Your diner has potential, Miss Vance." He said it quietly. "I'm not for sale. My diner is not a project." "And what happened on New Year's Eve? Your mother, the recipe, Lily." That's not something I can accept payment for. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm not accustomed to people refusing things, she said finally. I know, he said. That's part of what I'm trying to tell you. He thought she might hang up. Instead, she said, slightly stiffly, then what am I supposed to do with this? Donate it to the Greenview Hospice, he said, in your mother's name. Silence again. And then, very quietly, something that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. Lily's awake, he said. She's been asking about you. She wants to know if you'd like to come and bake on Saturday. The pause this time was different in quality, softer around the edges. I don't bake, Evelyn said. She'll teach you, Arthur said. She's very patient. Saturday morning, at 9 o'clock, Evelyn Vance arrived at Penny's diner in what she apparently considered casual clothing. Pressed trousers, a cream cashmere sweater, hair pulled back. She had no bodyguards. Evelyn had decided, in the cab over, that this was a reconnaissance mission and bodyguards would distort the data. Lily was waiting at the door in her purple apron with the cartoon pancake on it, and the expression on her face was the expression of a 6-year-old who has been ready for 45 minutes. I made you an apron, Lily announced, producing a small white apron from behind her back. It had been decorated with marker drawings, stars, a cupcake, a small wobbly figure that might have been a person or might have been a lamppost. I drew your picture on it. That's you. She pointed at the wobbly figure. Evelyn looked at the apron. She looked at Lily's expectant face. She put on the apron. The morning that followed was the kind that inserts itself permanently into a person's memory, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything that happened was precisely, unpretentiously real. Lily stood on her step stool and directed operations with the authority of a small general. Arthur moved around the kitchen in the unhurried, economical way of someone completely at home in it, reaching past Evelyn for the vanilla extract with a murmured sorry when his arm briefly grazed her shoulder, handing her the sifter when she needed it before she'd thought to ask for it. Evelyn burned her first batch. She stood looking at the dozen blackened cupcakes on the baking sheet with an expression she generally reserved for financial losses. That's okay, Lily said sagely. Daddy always says the burnt ones teach you the most. Evelyn looked at Arthur, who was leaning in the doorway to the kitchen with his arms folded and an expression she couldn't immediately read, something steady and warm, like a fire behind glass. Does he? She said. Allegedly, Arthur confirmed. Although I'll note that Lily usually says that right after she eats a burnt one on purpose. They taste different, Lily said, with dignity. They taste more. The second batch came out perfectly, and when Evelyn took the first one off the tray, slightly uneven, its vanilla frosting applied with more enthusiasm than skill, and bit into it, she went very still for a moment. Not the freezing stillness of the first night, but something more like the stillness of a person standing in sunlight and allowing themselves to feel it. It's good, she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it more than most things she'd said in recent memory. Of course it is, Lily said. We made it together. Things you make together are always better. Evelyn looked at this small child, flower on her nose, absolute confidence in her own wisdom, and felt something shift inside her chest that had not shifted since she was 9 years old. The call came at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, 6 weeks into the new year. Evelyn was still at her desk. She was always still at her desk at 11:17, when her CFO's name appeared on her screen. Thomas Rees was a meticulous, measured man. He did not call after business hours unless there was cause. Evelyn. His voice was tight. Richard filed a petition this afternoon. Incompetence clause. He's claiming executive incapacity. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. What followed was the worst week of Evelyn's professional life, which was saying something, because she had survived her corporate inheritance at 23 with nothing but her mother's surname and her own catastrophic determination. Richard Vance, her father's younger brother, who had managed to fail upward through 3 decades of nepotism and veiled threats, had apparently spent the past 8 months assembling a coalition on the board. He had frozen a significant portion of her operating accounts pending an emergency review. He had leaked to 2 financial publications the suggestion that Evelyn was emotionally unstable and suffering from a breakdown, citing, of all things, her behavior on New Year's Eve, when photographs taken by a diner at Aubergine had shown her kneeling on the floor. The photographs had a caption, "Ice Queen melts down at luxury restaurant." Her PR team was managing it. Her lawyers were mobilizing. But the resources that should have been available to fight on 3 fronts simultaneously had been quietly, skillfully strangled. Richard had done this slowly and carefully, the way bad things usually happen, not in a single moment, but in 100 small decisions over years, each one defensible in isolation. Evelyn worked for 72 hours without leaving her office tower. She ate sparingly and slept not at all. By Thursday night, her hands were shaking slightly when she poured her 4th cup of coffee, and she noticed this with the clinical detachment of someone monitoring a system's failure that is happening to someone else. She left the building at 1 in the morning. She meant to get in her car. Instead, she walked. It was February, and the cold had the mean, specific quality of a city winter that has run out of the gentleness it started with. The snow was old and dirty. Evelyn walked without direction for 20 minutes, 30, until the expensive district gave way to working-class blocks, and she realized that she had been, without consciously deciding it, walking toward the Millbrook district. She was standing outside Penny's diner, which was dark and closed, its Christmas lights long since taken down, when her legs stopped cooperating. She stood on the sidewalk and thought, with a detachment that frightened her, that she was not sure she could get back to her car under her own power. She knocked on the diner door. Light appeared from the back, the living quarters above and behind the diner where Arthur and Lily lived. Then the light in the diner itself, then the door, and then Arthur, in a gray flannel shirt, holding a mug of something warm. He took in her condition in one quiet glance, the pallor, the shaking hands, the 72 hours written plainly on her face. He did not ask questions. He opened the door wider and stepped back, and Evelyn Vance walked inside. Arthur set her up in the corner booth with a blanket, a bowl of soup, and 2 pieces of toast. He sat across from her and said nothing, which turned out to be exactly right, because what Evelyn needed was not advice or questions or the performance of being managed, but simply the presence of someone who was not afraid of her difficulty. She told him about Richard. She told him about the board, the frozen accounts, the photographs. She told him, haltingly, about the years she had spent building Vance Enterprises after her mother died. The years of making herself impervious because she had learned that every softness was a target. She told him that she had spent 12 years believing that if she was hard enough, careful enough, cold enough, she could not be hurt. And Arthur asked, and it turns out, Evelyn said, wrapping both hands around the mug, that a man who has been planning this for 8 months doesn't particularly care how cold I am. Arthur nodded. He did not say I'm sorry, which she appreciated. He said instead, what do you need? She looked at him for a moment. In the amber light of the diner, he looked different from how he looked in daylight. Less the ordinary man in the worn coat, and more like what, she was gradually beginning to understand, he actually was. Something in his posture, in the quality of his attention, carried an authority that had nothing to do with money or display. I don't know, she admitted. It was the most honest thing she had said in years. Then sleep, he said. You can figure out what you need in the morning. Sleep in the booth. Dorothy comes in at 6. I'll tell her you're a slightly overdressed furniture piece and not to disturb you. Despite everything, the company, the uncle, the shaking hands, Evelyn laughed. It came out small and unpolished, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth immediately afterward, surprised by the sound of it. Stay, Arthur said simply. Nobody has to be alone on New Year's. He glanced at the window at the dark February street outside. Or any night, really. That's just when people say it. She stayed. In the morning, Lily found her asleep in the corner booth, her cashmere coat folded neatly over her shoulders, and announced at a volume suited for the outdoors that the fancy lady had come for breakfast, and could they please make the good kind of eggs. The men came on a Friday. There were 4 of them, not the rough extortionist type Arthur had dealt with in the alley, but something more calibrated and therefore more dangerous. They wore suits. They arrived in a car that cost more than Arthur's diner. They came in during the quiet hour between lunch and dinner, occupying the center stools with the ease of men who consider any room they enter their own. Their leader, a man named Gresham, who delivered Richard Vance's messages with the smooth competence of someone who had been well compensated for his ethics, placed an envelope on the counter. Mr. Pendleton, my employer is aware that you've been spending considerable time with Miss Vance. He wanted to suggest, Gresham smiled a precise, professional smile, that going forward, It would be in everyone's best interest if that hospitality came to an end. He tapped the envelope. Quite generous terms, really. Arthur stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a cloth. He did not look at the envelope. Your employer's name? He asked. I represent several business interests, Gresham said. You can think of this as a general community message. People in this neighborhood, he looked around the diner with polished disdain, do best when they understand the scale of the interests they're operating next to. He paused. You're a small man in a small place, Pendleton. Small places get paved over. That's just how cities work. Arthur set down his cloth. He appeared to think about something for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and picked up his phone. He made a call. It lasted perhaps 90 seconds. He said 3 sentences, listened for 30 seconds, said 2 more, and put the phone down. You can tell whoever sent you, Arthur said, that the conversation is over. Gresham waited for more. When no more came, he stood, straightened his jacket, and led his men out. Dorothy, who had watched the entire exchange from the coffee station without moving, poured herself a cup and said, Who did you call? Old friends, Arthur said. How old? Long enough to have been waiting patiently. The next morning, the financial pages led with a story that had the quality of a depth charge, the kind that takes a moment to arrive but displaces everything when it does. Chef returns. Industry titan Arthur Pendleton resurfaces after 5-year absence, and he's not coming back alone. The article was the first of 6 published that day, across financial, culinary, and general news platforms. Together they told a story that the food world had been half suspecting and unable to confirm for years. That Arthur Pendleton, known in culinary circles as Chef A, who at 30 had held 3 Michelin stars, had grown a struggling family restaurant group into a 9-location empire, and had been on the verge of closing a landmark international culinary brand deal, had not simply disappeared. He had been destroyed. 5 years ago, at the height of his career, Arthur had been positioned to close an international culinary license and investment agreement worth hundreds of millions. The deal would have made him, by his early 30s, one of the most influential figures in the global food industry. Instead, it had collapsed spectacularly and publicly, taking his restaurants, his reputation, and, in the same year that also brought Caroline's diagnosis, nearly everything else. The collapse had been engineered. The articles, drawing on documents that had been in careful custody for 5 years, assembled by Arthur himself, with the help of lawyers, journalists, and industry colleagues who had not forgotten what had been done, named the architect of the sabotage, Richard Vance. He had been a silent investor in the competing hospitality group. He had fabricated food safety violations at Arthur's flagship restaurant. He had bribed 2 key board members of the investment firm to reject the deal, and had subsequently ensured that Arthur's name was blacklisted from every major industry platform he attempted to rebuild through. By noon, Richard Vance's board had received the documents. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 journalists had corroborated the financial irregularities that Arthur's legal team had been quietly preparing to publish for a year. By 4, the first federal inquiry notice had been filed. Arthur spent most of that day in his kitchen, cooking the dinner service. Dorothy kept bringing him updates on her phone, setting them beside him like small offerings, and he read each one with the same steady expression, not triumph, exactly, but the clean, releasing sensation of a long-held weight finally being set down. Evelyn learned what Arthur was from a news alert on her phone at 7:30 in the morning. She sat in her hotel room and read the first article 3 times. Then she set the phone down, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and called Arthur. He answered on the first ring. Were you ever going to tell me? She asked. Yes, he said, when the time was right. And when was the time going to be right? A pause. Probably around now, he said. Are you angry? She thought about it honestly. She was a person who had been deceived, manipulated, and positioned by powerful men her entire adult life. She thought about Arthur in his gray coat on New Year's Eve, sitting across from her with his daughter falling asleep in his arms, and what she felt was not anger. What she felt was something more complicated, a rush of something like recognition, like 2 people who have been walking parallel roads that have just finally converged. No, she said, but I have questions. I know, he said. Come to the diner. Over coffee and the breakfast Arthur cooked her, eggs that were, as Lily had once insisted, the good kind. He told her everything. About the deal. about Richard's sabotage, about Caroline's illness beginning in the same month the restaurants collapsed, and how he had made the calculation that fighting had to come second to being with her. About the 5 years since, where he had lived quietly with Lily, running the diner, keeping his head down, allowing the evidence to accumulate with the patience of someone who knows that justice, when it finally comes, should be inescapable. "You were waiting," Evelyn said. "I was waiting until I had everything I needed to make sure he couldn't escape it." He looked at his coffee, and until Lily was old enough that the upheaval wouldn't land on her the way it might have when she was very small. Evelyn thought about the uncle who had spent 12 years working against her, slowly, quietly, with the confidence of a man who believed he was dealing with someone who would never know. She thought about the boardroom, the frozen accounts, the photographs, the word breakdown placed so carefully next to her name in the press. "He went after you first," she said. "And then when that didn't destroy you, he went after me. He goes after anyone he perceives as a threat to what he wants," Arthur said. "That's what people like him do. They don't stop until something stops them." Within a week, what stopped Richard Vance arrived with the thoroughness of a carefully planned operation. The culinary fraud documentation went to the relevant industry bodies and the Federal Trade Commission simultaneously. Arthur's legal team, quiet, formidable, and assembled and waiting for this moment for 2 years, filed on multiple fronts. Financial analysts who had long been suspicious of certain Vance Enterprises irregularities provided corroboration that had previously been missing. 2 of Richard's own former associates, apparently having spent their own time waiting for someone to move first, provided sworn statements. Arthur himself gave one interview. He sat in his diner, in his apron, at the counter where he cooked breakfast every morning, and was asked how he felt about Richard Vance's imminent arrest. "I feel," he said, "that it's been a long time coming, and I'm grateful it happened before Lily was old enough to have to fully understand it." He was asked if he would be returning to the culinary world. He looked down at the counter, at the flour dusted on his hands, at the coffee ring on the prep surface, at the small drawing Lily had done that was taped to the cash register. A man and a little girl, and, in the last several weeks, a third figure beside them, taller, with dark hair. "I'm already in the culinary world," he said simply. Richard Vance was arrested on the 14th of February, a coincidence of timing that Dorothy described as appropriate, given that he had made a career of destroying things other people loved. Evelyn was reinstated as sole executive authority of Vance Enterprises within the same week, the board having voted with the kind of unanimity that follows the revelation that the person who organized against the CEO had been simultaneously embezzling from the company for 9 years. She stood in the boardroom afterward, looking out at the city below, the same city she had looked at for 10 years from this window, feeling the weight of it like armor she couldn't take off. And she thought, quite clearly and simply, that she wanted to go home. She picked up her phone and called Arthur. "Are you cooking tonight?" she asked. "Always," he said. "Can I come?" "Lily will be furious if you don't," he said. "She's been talking about showing you her new trick with pastry dough since Tuesday." The cemetery was on the east side of the city, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood that had the settled peace of a place visited regularly and thoughtfully. The snow was almost gone by March, just traces at the base of the older headstones, clinging in the shadows where the sun hadn't reached. It had been Arthur's idea, and he'd asked gently, uncertain if Evelyn would want it. She had said yes immediately, which had surprised him and perhaps surprised her too. They went on a Sunday morning, the 3 of them. Lily carried flowers she had chosen herself, yellow daffodils, because Lily believed that cheerful flowers were more respectful of people you love than sad ones. Sad flowers make sad graveyards, she had explained with great seriousness in the flower shop. Mum Lily in the window told me. They visited Caroline's grave first. Arthur crouched down and cleared the small amount of debris that had gathered since his last visit, and he talked to Caroline the way he always talked to her, quietly, conversationally, as if she had just stepped out of the room. He told her about the restaurant, about Lily starting first grade and already showing an alarming aptitude for arithmetic. He told her that they'd had a good New Year's, that the dress had fit perfectly, that the cupcake recipe had done something he hadn't expected. Lily placed her daffodils carefully against the headstone, then reached up and held his hand. Evelyn stood slightly to the side, and she felt something in the tableau before her that she would later struggle to name, a profound absence of performance. Arthur loved his wife not as a project or a narrative, but simply, quietly, as a fact of his life. His grief was not a wound he was nursing or a story he was telling. It was just whether he had learned to live in, as much a part of him as his hands. Margaret Vance's grave was 3 sections north. Evelyn had not been there in 2 years. She stood before the white marble headstone. Clean, the name carved in a font her mother had apparently chosen herself with characteristic practicality, and felt the old familiar hardening begin at the base of her throat. Arthur put his hand between her shoulder blades. Not a pressure, just a presence. It was enough to prevent the hardening. She gave your wife a recipe, Evelyn said. It came out ragged at the edges, the way things do when you haven't said them before. She was lying in a hospice bed, and she was still giving people things. That's who she was, Arthur said. I know. Evelyn pressed her lips together. I know. I wasn't there enough. I thought I had time. I thought if I built the company to a certain point, if I secured enough, she stopped. The sentence had nowhere left to go. She knew, Arthur said. The woman who knew your mother, my wife, used to tell me that your mother spoke about you every day, that she was so proud of you she could barely contain it, that she understood why you couldn't be there more. He paused. She said your mother prayed that you'd find warmth someday, that you'd find somewhere you could put the armor down. Evelyn stood for a long moment in the cold March air, and then she pressed her palm to the cold marble of her mother's headstone, and she spoke to her, not loudly, not perfectly, in a voice that broke in several places, and said the things she had been holding since February 12 years ago. The apologies, the love, the gratitude for the recipe passed across a hospice room like a small lamp carried forward through time. Lily stood beside her and held her hand while she did it, without comment, without ceremony, just present, the way children can be present when they understand that the moment requires nothing more than bearing witness. On the way home, in the warmth of the car, Lily fell asleep between them on the back seat, her head on Evelyn's shoulder, the yellow flowers still loosely clutched in her small hand. Evelyn looked down at her and did not move, afraid of disturbing her. Arthur was looking out the window, his hand resting on his knee. She always falls asleep on other people, he said. She says it's because people feel safe. Does she fall asleep on you? Evelyn asked. Every time, he said, and smiled at the passing city. Spring came late that year, arriving in April with the tentative, apologetic quality of something that knows it's overdue. The diner put tables out on the sidewalk for the first time. Lily drew a sign that said Welcome Spring in letters that took up most of a large piece of cardboard, and Dorothy taped it in the window where it remained for the rest of the month. Evelyn had settled into the irregular but genuine rhythm of a person who has found a place where they fit. She came to the diner 3 evenings a week, sometimes 4. She sat at the counter with her laptop while Arthur closed out the kitchen, doing the kind of work she could do anywhere now that Richard's constraints had been lifted, and she had learned to accept the bowl of something warm that Arthur always set in front of her without protest, because arguing about it had proven entirely ineffective. She had learned things about Arthur in these months that his coat and his diner would not have volunteered. She had learned that he spoke French and Italian, which came out when Lily demanded a French word for everything at the dinner table for a week. She had learned that the book he was always reading, quietly, in the last 20 minutes before he opened the diner each morning, was different every week, and the range was wide. Philosophy, architecture, biography, occasionally poetry, which he read with the unself-conscious appreciation of someone who had never been taught that poetry was something to be embarrassed about. She had learned that his cooking, which she had already known was extraordinary, was of a caliber that the diner's modest surroundings did nothing to accommodate, that his flavors were built with the specific, cumulative intelligence of a person who understood food as a language with grammar and nuance and things that couldn't quite be translated. She had learned that he watched her, not intrusively, not the practiced, assessing attention of a person collecting information, gently, the way he watched the weather from the window before going out, the way he watched Lily on the playground from the bench nearby, as if her well-being was something he was paying attention to because it mattered to him personally, without agenda. She had learned that this, more than anything else, was what had taken up residence in her chest and declined to leave. Arthur confessed on a Tuesday. He had not planned it for Tuesday. He had not planned it at all. Lily was in bed. Evelyn was on her usual stool at the counter. Arthur was wiping down the prep surface for the last time, and the silence between them had the particular quality it had developed in recent weeks, warm and slightly weighted, like a room where both people know that something is about to be said and are moving around it carefully. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up from her laptop. He stopped wiping the counter. He set the cloth down. He looked at her in the way that he had, directly, without calculation, with the full weight of his attention. "I have a lot of baggage," he said. "I have a 6-year-old and a ghost and a career I walked away from and a diner that smells like coffee at all hours and a past that landed in the papers 2 months ago and is not going to stop being complicated." He said it plainly, without decoration, but with the careful honesty of someone offering all the information rather than just the useful parts. "I'm not a simple situation. I'm aware," Evelyn said. "And I know that you've just come through something that would have finished most people, and you're rebuilding. And I have no interest in making that harder by complicating things between us." He was quiet for a moment. "But I think you should know that you matter to me. That what I feel when you're here is," he stopped. "Search for the word with the scrupulousness of a person for whom the right word is not negotiable." "Home," he said finally. "It feels like home, and I haven't felt that in a long time." Evelyn was quiet. Then, from upstairs, came the soft padding of small feet, and Lily appeared at the kitchen door in her rabbit pajamas, holding a piece of paper. "I made you something," she said, approaching Evelyn directly with the confidence of a person who has decided what is going to happen. "At school, for the art show. Miss Duncan said it was the best family picture in the class." She handed Evelyn the drawing. It showed 3 figures holding hands, a tall one on the left, a small one in the middle, and a slightly less tall one on the right. They had large, circular smiles. Above them was a house, a building with a crooked sign that could only be the diner. Above the figures, Lily had written 3 labels in the careful, unsteady capitals of a child who was still friends with the letters rather than fully in command of them. "Daddy. Me. My new mommy." The arrow pointing at the 3rd figure was elaborate and confident. Evelyn looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she looked at Lily, who was watching her with the patient, luminous certainty of someone who is not asking a question but presenting a conclusion. "I'm not sure I know how to be someone's mommy," Evelyn said, very quietly. Lily considered this. "Daddy didn't know how to be a daddy either," she said. "He says he figured it out. He says the figuring out part is the best part." She glanced at Arthur, then back at Evelyn. "Also, I've been practicing calling you mommy in my head for 2 months, and I'm pretty good at it." Evelyn stood from her stool. She crossed the 4 feet between the counter and where Arthur was standing, 4 feet that felt much larger than that, and she looked up at him with the directness that was her natural register, but with something in it now that had not been there in the person who had walked into Aubergine 6 months ago, warmth and the willingness to be known. "You're not a simple situation either, Arthur Pendleton," she said. "I know," he said. "Good." She looked up at him. He was taller by several inches. "Because simple situations have never interested me." Lily, who had watched this exchange with arms folded in the posture of an extremely satisfied project manager, nodded once, returned to the kitchen for a glass of water, and went back to bed. Exactly 1 year after the night it began, New Year's Eve settled over the city with the same generous, unhurried snowfall, the fat, lazy flakes that turned the streets into something from a painting, that caught in children's hair and on restaurant awnings and on the shoulders of a man standing on the sidewalk of Harwick Avenue, looking up at the sign above the door. Pendleton's it was new, the sign. The lettering was clean and warm, backlit with amber light against the dark. Below it, smaller, open to everyone. And below that, smaller still, in Lily's handwriting, because she had insisted on this and Arthur had, after a brief negotiation, agreed, a small drawing of a cupcake. The restaurant had been open for 3 months. In the space where Aubergine had once stood, Aubergine, which had changed ownership twice in the past year and had finally closed its elegant doors in October, Pendleton's had opened with a menu that was, depending on who you asked, either the finest contemporary cuisine in the city or the most inviting neighborhood bistro in recent memory. Both descriptions were accurate, because Arthur had designed it specifically to be both. He had decided, over many long nights at the prep counter, that the finest food should not require its guests to feel like they are being evaluated. That warmth and excellence were not opposing forces. but the same force, channeled toward the same end. There were no dress codes at Pendleton's. There was a children's menu that was taken as seriously as the tasting menu. There was a table always reserved, not for celebrities or corporations, but for what the reservation system recorded simply as community, a rotating arrangement with local shelters and hospice visitors and families who couldn't afford the prices but deserved the meal. This was not advertised. It was simply done, the way the things you are most certain about rarely need announcement. The restaurant was full tonight. Every table occupied, the warmth rolling out even when the front door opened to admit another guest. The sound of conversation and laughter, and the particular joy of a room full of people who are exactly where they want to be on the most celebratory night of the year. Arthur stood for one more moment on the sidewalk, his face tilted upward toward the snow, letting the cold settle on him the way it had 1 year ago on this same street, but differently. The cold that year had been something to endure. Tonight it was simply weather, and he was warm enough to feel it as beautiful. He went inside. The kitchen was the most alive part of it. Always, in any restaurant, the kitchen was where the heartbeat was. His team moved around each other with the practiced fluency of people who had been recruited because they were excellent and managed because they were valued. And the food moving out of the past was, Arthur permitted himself to think, without false modesty, very good. At 8 o'clock, he took off his chef's whites and came out of the kitchen. Evelyn was at the corner table, approximately where a table for two had once sat in the former aubergine's configuration, rebuilt and reset without ceremony, because Arthur had wanted to see if the geography still meant anything. It did. She was in a deep blue dress that she'd bought specifically for tonight, her dark hair loose. She had started wearing it loose in the past few months, since Lily had announced one evening that Evelyn looked more like a person when her hair wasn't so serious. At her ears were small diamond studs that had been her mother's. She had found them in a jewelry box she'd finally allowed herself to go through last summer, and she wore them now not as ornament, but as proximity, as a way of carrying Margaret Vance into rooms that had taken too long to find. Lily was beside her, in dark green velvet, her choice, because she had been resolute on velvet, her copper hair in a single braid that she'd done herself with some assistance from Evelyn, who had surprised them both by turning out to have an excellent instinct for braiding. Lily was drawing on the back of a paper placemat with the focused contentment of a child who is entirely where she wants to be, narrating quietly to herself about a dragon named Gerald who had been invited to the party and was very excited. Arthur slid into the seat across from them. Kitchen signed off. Evelyn asked, "James has it. He's better than I am on New Year's Eve. He gets faster when the stakes are high. You trained him. And he surpassed me, which is the objective." He looked at Lily's drawing. A scene that appeared to involve a dragon, 3 people, and what might have been a snowstorm or an explosion. "What's happening here?" "Gerald is bringing cupcakes," Lily said, without looking up. "He's the guest of honor." The night moved the way good nights do, through the courses, through the conversations, through the midnight toast when the room erupted and Lily put her hands over her ears and grinned at the same time. And Dorothy, present at her favorite corner table with her husband, and a look of thoroughly vindicated satisfaction, raised her glass across the room at Arthur, and Arthur raised his back. At 12:15, when the room had settled into its post-midnight warmth and the snow outside was still falling as softly as a held breath, Arthur reached into his jacket pocket. He placed on the table, between them, a single vanilla cupcake. It had been made that morning in the Pendletons' kitchen, with Lily's assistance and Arthur's hands, and the recipe that had traveled from a hospice room through 2 women's hearts and arrived, against all probability and through all the grief in between, at this particular table on this particular night. The frosting was vanilla, perfectly smooth. In the center, pressed gently into the frosting, was a small circle of gold. Lily, who had been pretending to draw for the past 20 minutes while monitoring developments with intense peripheral attention, looked up and then immediately looked back down at her placemat with the elaborate casualness of someone entirely uninvolved. Evelyn looked at the cupcake. She looked at the ring pressed into the frosting. She looked at Arthur. "You hit a ring and a cupcake," she said. "I did. That's," she paused. A smile was beginning at the corners of her mouth. "That's extremely on-brand for this relationship." "Lily suggested it," he said. "She said it was thematically appropriate. She's not wrong." He reached across the table and took her hand. A hand he knew now. The shape of its knuckles, the way she pressed her thumb against her ring finger when she was thinking, the warmth it carried that she had once kept so carefully hidden and now offered freely. The way people offer things when they have stopped expecting them to be taken as weakness. "I don't have a speech," he said. "You know me well enough to know that the only things I can put in a speech are the things I've already said, and the things I've already said are the truest things I know. That you walked into a terrible year and made it the best year I've had in a long time. That my daughter's favorite person, after a long period during which that position was held exclusively by Gerald the Dragon, is you. That this," he gestured, encompassing the table, the room, the snow outside, the whole implausible year of warmth rebuilt from cold, "is what I want." He looked at her steadily, the way he always looked at the things that mattered, without performance, without flourish, with just the full weight of his attention and the open, uncalculating honesty of someone who has learned that love is not a feeling that arrives once, but a decision you keep making every day, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that staying actually looks like. "Evelyn Vance," he said, "will you stay?" She held the ring for a moment, a small circle of gold with a single, simple diamond, chosen by someone who knew that she did not need to be impressed, only seen. That she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time, in the amber light of a diner in the Millbrook district, by a man in a worn coat who had offered her soup in silence at 1 o'clock in the morning without asking for anything in return. "Yes," she said. Lily abandoned all pretense. She was out of her chair and between them before the word had finished sounding, and Arthur lifted her with one arm and held her, and Evelyn pressed her forehead against Arthur's shoulder and closed her eyes, and around them the restaurant swelled with sound and light, and the smell of good food, and the snow kept falling outside on Harwick Avenue in the same soft, indifferent, beautiful way it had fallen 1 year ago when a small girl in a red velvet dress had walked across a silent dining room, carrying a cupcake like it was a lantern. "Gerald would have wanted to be here," Lily announced into Arthur's shoulder. "Gerald will get his own cupcake," Arthur said. "Dedicated to him personally. Dedicated to him personally." Evelyn laughed. The good kind, the unpolished, unperformed kind that had been waiting in her chest for 12 years for the room temperature to be right. And outside, the snow fell on Harwick Avenue, unhurried and generous, the fat, lazy kind that settles on a child's eyelashes and turns the whole city into a snow globe. And in the window of Pendleton's the amber light held warm against the dark, and the sign read "Open to everyone," because that had always been the only rule worth keeping. Because that was what a cupcake passed from a dying woman to a young one, from a wife to a husband, from a child to a stranger in a cold restaurant on the coldest night of the year, had always been trying to say. Nobody should be alone on New Year's. And nobody was.